I didn't notice when I stopped expecting her to reply. That's the part that still feels strange when I think about it now. Because if someone had asked me back then whether I expected her to answer my messages, I would have said yes. Of course I would have said yes. That's what you expect when you're with someone. You send something. They answer. Even if it takes a while. Even if it's later that night. Even if it's the next morning. There's still a response. There's still that sense that what you said landed somewhere. And for a long time, that's how it was with us. I didn't think about it. I didn't have to. It just worked the way conversation is supposed to work when two people are paying attention to each other. I would send her something small during the day. Not important. Just something I noticed or something that reminded me of her. Sometimes a question about what she was doing. Sometimes just a sentence about something that happened at work. And she answered. Not immediately every time, but consistently enough that I never wondered whether she would. That consistency becomes invisible after a while. You stop noticing it the same way you stop noticing the sound of your own footsteps when you walk somewhere familiar. It's just part of being together. I think that's why it took me so long to notice when it changed. Because nothing about it changed all at once. There wasn't a day when she suddenly stopped answering. There wasn't a week when everything went quiet. It happened slower than that. So slow that each version of it still felt normal while it was happening. At least at first. When we first started talking, before we were even officially together, I remember how easy it felt to reach her. That's the word that comes back to me now. Reach. It felt like she was there. Not physically, obviously, but present in a way that made distance feel smaller than it actually was. I could send her something in the middle of the afternoon, knowing she was busy, knowing she had things going on, and still feel like it mattered that I said it. Not because she always answered right away, just because she always answered eventually. And when she did, it sounded like she had actually read what I wrote. Like she remembered where the conversation had been. Like she stayed inside it. That mattered more than I realized at the time. Because it meant I didn't have to decide whether something was worth saying before I said it. I could just say it, and trust that it would be received somewhere. There was one afternoon early on that I still remember clearly. I sent her something small. Just a picture of a street I was walking down on my lunch break. There wasn't anything special about it. Just a row of trees that looked different than they had the week before. I wrote something like, "These look different today?" And she answered with a question about where I was walking and what had changed. Not because the trees were interesting, but because I had noticed them. That's what stayed with me. She stayed with what I noticed. And after that, I started sending her more things like that. Small observations. Half-formed thoughts. Things that didn't need a reply but felt better with one. And she kept replying. So I kept sending them. It's strange how quickly something like that becomes part of how you move through your day. I didn't think about whether I was reaching out too often. I didn't think about whether what I was saying was important enough. Because I wasn't reaching into silence. I was reaching into something that answered back. And that changes the way you speak to someone. You stop measuring your words before they leave you. You stop deciding what deserves a response. You just let the connection exist the way it wants to exist. At least that's how it felt back then. The first time she didn't answer one of my messages, I didn't notice. Not right away. I only noticed later that evening when I looked back through the conversation and realized there was something I had said earlier that day that she never responded to. But that didn't feel important. People miss messages. People forget. People get busy. It didn't feel like anything had changed. It just felt like one of those small gaps that happen sometimes. So I didn't think about it again. The second time I noticed. Not because it was different. Just because it happened close enough to the first time that I remembered the first one. Still, it didn't feel like a pattern. It just felt like timing. Like coincidence. Like something that didn't need attention yet. And I didn't give it any. It wasn't until later that I started noticing something else. It wasn't just that some messages didn't get replies. It was that I started checking whether they would. Not in an anxious way. Just noticing. Like I would send something and then, later that day, find myself wondering whether she had answered yet. I hadn't done that before. Before that, I just assumed she would. And I didn't realize how different those two things were until much later. There was a night when I sent her something about my day that had stayed with me longer than I expected. Not a big thing. Just something that made me stop and think for a minute at work. I told her about it the way I always did. Not carefully. Not formally. Just the way I would have said it if she had been standing next to me instead of somewhere else. And she didn't answer. Not that night. Not the next morning. And by the time she did answer later the next day, the conversation had already moved somewhere else. She replied to something newer. Something easier. something that didn't require going back. And I didn't bring the earlier thing up again, because it already felt like it belonged to a different moment. And I think that was the first time I understood something had shifted. Not in her exactly. In me. Because I didn't expect her to go back to it. I just let it stay unanswered. And that felt normal. Or at least it felt normal enough that I didn't question it yet. After that, I started noticing how often conversations moved forward without returning to where they had been. Not dramatically, just quietly, like something would be left behind and neither of us would pick it up again. And I adjusted to that faster than I expected to, because at first I still sent things the same way, still told her what I noticed, still asked questions, still shared small pieces of my day. But slowly, I started waiting longer before sending them, just long enough to decide whether they were worth saying without a reply. And once I started doing that, something changed again, because now I wasn't just talking to her. I was deciding whether talking to her made sense. And I hadn't done that before. At first, I thought I was just being more patient. That's what I told myself. People get busy. People have long days. People forget to answer things that aren't urgent. It didn't feel fair to expect every message to come back with the same attention every time. So I adjusted. Not in a dramatic way, just quietly. If I sent something and she didn't answer, I stopped checking for the reply as quickly. If she answered later, I picked the conversation back up from wherever she started again. I told myself that was what being easy to be with looked like. Flexible, understanding, not demanding more than what the moment could give. And I believed that for a while. Or maybe I wanted to, because it felt better than wondering whether something had changed. There was a stretch of time when I started rereading what I wrote before I sent it. Not every message, just some of them. The ones that were less obvious. The ones that didn't clearly need a reply. I would type something, pause, and think, is this worth sending if she doesn't answer? That question had never existed between us before. I didn't even realize when it first showed up. But once it did, it stayed. And after that, I started deleting things more often. Not because they were too personal, just because they didn't feel necessary anymore. Or maybe they didn't feel like they had a place to land. There was one afternoon when I almost sent her something about my mom. Nothing serious. Just something small she had said earlier that day that stayed with me longer than I expected. Normally, I would have told her right away. That used to be the easiest kind of thing to share with her. The small things that didn't need context. The things that only mattered because they happened. I typed the message. I looked at it. And then I deleted it. Not because I didn't want to tell her. Just because I wasn't sure it needed to be said anymore. And that felt new. Not uncomfortable exactly. Just unfamiliar. Like something I used to do automatically now required a decision. There's a difference between choosing not to say something and not expecting it to be answered. I didn't understand that difference right away. At first I thought I was just saying less because there was less to say. But later I started realizing that wasn't true. There were still things I wanted to tell her. They just stayed with me longer before I decided whether to send them. And sometimes they stayed with me long enough that I stopped sending them at all. There was a night when I noticed something that stayed with me longer than I expected. We were sitting together on her couch, talking the way we always did in the evenings. Small things, pieces of the day, plans for the weekend, nothing unusual. And she asked me how work had been. I said, it was fine. And she nodded, and we moved on. And that should have been normal. But it didn't feel normal. Because earlier that day, work hadn't felt fine. There had been something I wanted to tell her about. Something I had almost sent in a message earlier, but didn't. Something I thought I would tell her when I saw her in person. And when the moment arrived, I didn't. Not because she interrupted me. Not because there wasn't time. Just because the conversation didn't stay there long enough for it to happen. And I didn't try to bring it back. That surprised me later. Not in the moment. In the moment it felt easy to let it pass. But afterward I kept thinking about it. Because I realized something small had changed again. Before that, if she asked how my day was, I would tell her what actually stayed with me. Not the summary. The real version. And that night I didn't. And she didn't ask anything else. And I didn't expect her to. Expectations change quietly. That's what I keep coming back to. They don't disappear all at once. They just shift. Until one day you realize you're no longer waiting for something you used to rely on. And that realization doesn't feel dramatic. It feels ordinary. Almost reasonable. Like something that makes sense now that it's already happened. There was one message I still remember more clearly than the others. Not because it was important. Just because it stayed unanswered in a way that felt different. I sent her something late in the evening. Just a short thought. Something I would have told her in person if she had been sitting next to me. Nothing serious. Just something I noticed about myself that day. Something I didn't fully understand yet. I sent it without thinking too much about it, the way I used to. And she didn't answer that night, or the next morning. And later the next day, she sent me something else. A question about dinner. A completely new conversation. And I answered her question. And we talked about dinner. And I never brought the earlier message up again. Not because I forgot. I didn't forget. I just understood that it didn't belong anymore. And that understanding felt automatic. Like something I had already learned how to do without realizing it. After that, I started noticing how often conversations restarted instead of continuing. How often something I said earlier just stayed where it was. Untouched. Unanswered. Not ignored exactly. Just left behind. And I adjusted to that faster than I expected to. Because at some point I stopped expecting replies that went backward. I started expecting replies that moved forward instead. And once that expectation changed, the way I spoke to her changed too. There was a week when I realized I hadn't sent her anything during the day at all. Not on purpose. It just didn't happen. Usually there were small things I would send without thinking about them. A sentence. A question. Something I noticed. Something that reminded me of her. That week there wasn't any of that. And I didn't notice until the end of the week. When I looked back at the conversation and realized everything we said to each other had happened in the evenings. Only when we were already talking about something else. Only when there was already a reason to speak. And that surprised me more than I expected. Because it meant something had changed before I realized it had. Something underneath the surface of how we talked. Something about when I reached for her during the day. Or didn't. I didn't feel angry when I noticed that. I didn't feel like something had been taken from me. I just felt quieter. Like I had stopped reaching out in ways I used to. Not because I didn't want to. Just because I had stopped expecting those moments to come back the same way. And once I saw that clearly, I couldn't stop seeing it. Even in small things. Like how often I started a message and didn't send it. How often I thought, I'll tell her later. And then didn't. How often I noticed something that reminded me of her and kept it to myself instead of sharing it. Not because I wanted to keep it private. Just because the habit of sharing it had already changed. There was one evening when I understood something I hadn't said out loud, even to myself yet. We were sitting together again. Quiet. Comfortable in the way we still were with each other. And she was telling me something about her day. Something that had stayed with her. Something she needed to talk through. And I listened. The way I always had. The way I used to feel her listening to me. I stayed with her thoughts while she figured them out. I didn't rush them. I didn't move past them. I stayed inside them with her. And when she finished, she looked relieved. Like something had settled. And that's when I understood something I hadn't been ready to see before. She still expected replies from me the way I used to expect replies from her. And I gave them to her. Without thinking. Without hesitation. Without deciding whether they were worth giving. And I realized I had stopped expecting the same thing back. Not because she told me to. Not because we talked about it. Just because somewhere along the way, I learned not to expect replies anymore. And once I realized that, I couldn't quite stop thinking about it. Not in a dramatic way. It wasn't like something suddenly made sense all at once. It was more like a quiet understanding that had already been there for a while finally became clear enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore. I started noticing how natural it felt to answer her messages carefully. How automatic it was for me to respond to the things she told me. Even the small things. Especially the small things. If she sent me something during the day, something she noticed, something that bothered her, something she didn't fully understand yet, I answered it the way I always had. I stayed with it. Even when I was busy. Even when the reply took a little time. Even when I wasn't sure exactly what to say yet. I still answered. Not because I was trying to do something right. Just because that's what it felt like being with someone meant. And that made something else clearer too. I hadn't stopped answering her. I had just stopped expecting the same thing in return. There's a difference between patience and adjustment. I think for a long time I thought what I was doing was patience. I thought I was just giving her space. Giving her time. Letting conversations move the way they needed to move. But once I started paying attention more closely, I realized something else was happening. I wasn't waiting anymore. I had already stopped expecting. And those are not the same thing. Waiting means something might still come back. Not expecting means you've already decided it won't. Even if you never say that out loud. Even if you never admit it to yourself. There was one afternoon when I almost told her that. Not directly. Just something close to it. She had sent me a message about something small that happened at work. Something that annoyed her more than she expected. And I answered the way I always did. I stayed with what she said. Asked her what part of it stayed with her the most. Asked her what she thought it meant. And she told me more. And the conversation stayed there longer than usual. Long enough that it reminded me of how things used to feel between us. And for a moment, I almost said, I miss when we used to talk like this all the time. The thought was already there, almost ready to become a sentence. But I didn't say it, because I wasn't sure what she would hear if I did. Would she hear what I meant? Or would she hear something else? Would it sound like I was asking her to change something? Would it sound like I was saying something was wrong? And I wasn't sure either of those things were true. So I let the thought stay where it was, unsaid, like a lot of things had started staying. After that, I started noticing something I hadn't expected. It wasn't just that I stopped expecting replies. It was that I stopped writing messages that needed replies. That part surprised me more than anything else. Because at first I thought the change was outside me. Something that had happened between us. Something I was adjusting to. But once I started paying attention, I realized I had changed the shape of what I sent her. I started sending things that didn't require continuation. Things that didn't ask for follow-up. Things that could exist on their own without needing to be answered. And she answered those more easily, which made them easier to keep sending. And after a while, that became the way we talked. Not deeper, not shallower exactly, just finished. Each message standing on its own, instead of leaning on the next one. There was a night when that became especially clear. We were texting back and forth about something ordinary. Plans for the weekend. Groceries. What time we should meet. And I noticed how smooth the conversation felt. Efficient. Simple. Nothing getting left behind. Nothing needing explanation. Everything landing exactly where it was supposed to. And for a moment, I almost thought, this is easier now. But right after that, another thought followed it. This isn't what it used to feel like. And that second thought stayed longer. Because easier wasn't the same thing as closer. And I think somewhere inside me, I already knew that, even before I could explain it. I didn't say anything about it then. I didn't say, I think we talk differently now. I didn't say, I feel like something has changed between us. Because by then it didn't feel like something you fix by naming it. It felt like something that had already become normal. Something we had both adjusted to without realizing it. And once something becomes normal like that, it's hard to imagine what it would look like to go back, even if you wanted to. There was a week when I realized I had stopped checking my phone after I sent her something. Not completely, just differently. Before, if I sent her something during the day, there was always a small part of me that expected a reply. Not immediately, just eventually. And after a while, that expectation stopped being there. I would send something, and then keep going with my day the same way I would if I hadn't sent anything at all. And that felt like independence at first. Like something healthy. Like I was just becoming more comfortable with space. But later I realized it wasn't independence. It was adjustment. I had learned how to move forward without expecting the conversation to come back. And once I saw that clearly, it changed the way I thought about everything else too. There was one evening when I almost brought it up. Not as a complaint, just as something I noticed. We were sitting together again. Quiet. Comfortable the way we still were. And she asked me something about my day. And I answered. The way I always had lately. Short. Clear. Finished. And she nodded. And the conversation moved somewhere else. And I remember thinking, there was a time when this would have gone further. There was a time when she would have stayed with that answer longer. There was a time when I would have expected her to. And I almost said that. I almost told her what I was thinking right then. But I didn't. Because the moment already felt complete the way it was. And I didn't know how to reopen it without changing something neither of us had named yet. So I let it stay closed. The way so many other moments had stayed. After that, I think I understood something I hadn't been ready to say to myself before. I hadn't just learned not to expect replies. I had learned how to live without them. And once you learn that, it becomes part of how you move through the relationship. Even if everything else still looks the same. Even if you still talk every day. Even if you still sit next to each other at night. Something underneath the conversation changes. Quietly. And you don't always know how to change it back. Or if it was ever something you could change back at all. After that, I think I stopped noticing the silence the same way. Not because it went away. Just because it became expected. That's the part that's hardest to explain. Silence feels different when it surprises you. It feels like something is missing. But when it becomes familiar, it doesn't feel like silence anymore. It just feels like how things are. And I think that's when something in me really shifted. Not when she stopped replying as often. Not when I first noticed conversations ending earlier than they used to. But when I stopped waiting for them to continue. There used to be a rhythm between us. I didn't think about it back then. It was just there. I would send something. She would answer. Sometimes quickly, sometimes later, sometimes with a question, sometimes with something that moved the conversation somewhere new. And it felt like we were inside the same space, even when we weren't physically together. That rhythm carried us through the day, through work, through small things that didn't need to be shared but felt better when they were. And when that rhythm changed, I didn't hear it at first. I just adjusted my steps to match it. The way you do when someone next to you starts walking a little slower. You don't stop walking. You just slow down too. There was a morning when I noticed something small that would have reminded me of her before. Not something important, just a detail. Something I used to send her without thinking about it. And I remember picking up my phone automatically, opening the conversation, looking at the empty space where a message would go, and then putting the phone back down again. Not because I decided not to send it, just because I didn't expect anything to come back. And for a second, that surprised me, because I realized I hadn't even written the message first. Usually I would write it and then decide whether to send it. This time I stopped before that, before the sentence even existed. And that felt like something had changed earlier than I realized, earlier than I could point to. I started noticing how often that happened after that. How many things stayed with me that used to leave me immediately. How many small moments I kept to myself without deciding to. Not because they were private, not because they were too personal, just because they didn't feel like part of the conversation anymore. And I didn't know when that had started, only that it had. There was a night when she sent me something late, later than usual, just a short message about something that had happened earlier that day, something she was still thinking about. And I answered. Of course I answered, the way I always did. I stayed with what she said, asked her what she thought about it, asked her what part of it stayed with her the most. And she told me more. The conversation stretched longer than it had in a while. It felt familiar, comfortable, almost like something had returned. And for a moment, I felt that old rhythm again, the one where replies didn't feel like decisions. They just happened. And I almost told her that. I almost said, it feels like we haven't talked like this in a while. But I didn't, because I wasn't sure if she would hear what I meant, or if she would just hear something else, something heavier than what I was trying to say. So I stayed inside the conversation instead of stepping outside it. And eventually, it ended the way conversations do when people get tired. Naturally, without anything needing to be explained. The next morning, I noticed something else. I didn't expect that rhythm to continue, even after feeling it again the night before. I didn't wake up thinking, maybe things are different now. Maybe something is changing back. I just woke up the way I had been waking up for a while already, not expecting anything new. And that's when I understood something I hadn't been ready to admit before. It wasn't just that replies had become less certain. It was that my expectation of them had already settled somewhere else. Somewhere quieter, somewhere more careful. And once something settles there, it's hard to move it back, even when the moment invites you to. There was a time when I would check my phone without thinking about it. Not because I was waiting, just because I assumed something would be there. Not every time, but often enough that it felt natural. And after a while, that stopped happening too. Not suddenly, just gradually, until checking my phone felt like checking the time instead of checking for her. And I didn't realize when that shift happened, only that it had. I don't think she meant for any of this to happen. I've thought about that a lot. It would be easier to understand if there had been a moment when she said something clear, something that explained why replies changed, something that made the shift visible. But there wasn't. There was just time. And the way time changes things quietly when no one is paying attention to them directly. There was one evening when I almost asked her about it. Not directly, just something close. We were sitting together after dinner, talking the way we always did. Small things, ordinary things. And I remember thinking, do you notice that we talk differently now? The thought stayed with me longer than I expected. Long enough that I almost said it. But then another thought followed it. Maybe she doesn't notice. Maybe it only feels different to me. And I didn't want to turn something uncertain into something real if it didn't need to be. So I let it stay where it was, unsaid, the way so many other things had stayed. After that, I think something in me stopped trying to return to what the conversation used to be. Not consciously, just quietly, like I had already accepted that this was the version of us that existed now. And once you accept something like that, you stop reaching for the earlier version of it, even if you still remember it clearly, even if part of you still misses it. There are still moments now when I notice how automatic replies used to feel, how natural it felt to send something without thinking about whether it would be answered, how easy it was to assume the conversation would keep moving. And I think about how different that feels now. Not worse exactly, just different, quieter, more contained, like something that used to move freely now stays closer to where it starts. And sometimes I still catch myself starting a message the way I used to. Before remembering, I don't expect the reply anymore. And I stop, not because I have to, just because something in me already knows where the conversation will end. Or maybe where it won't continue. And that's usually where the thought stays. Right there, before the message is sent. I didn't notice right away what changed after that. Not in the relationship itself. Something in me. Because for a while, everything still looked the same from the outside. We still talked. Still sent each other messages during the day sometimes. Still asked how things were going. Still made plans. Still sat next to each other in the evenings the way we always had. If someone had asked me then whether anything was wrong, I would have said no. And I think I would have believed that when I said it. Because nothing had happened. There wasn't a moment where something ended. There wasn't a conversation where we named what had changed. There was just a quiet adjustment I had already made. And once I made it, I stayed there. I stopped sending things first as often. Not completely, just less automatically. Before that, if something happened during the day, my first instinct was still to tell her. Even if I waited a little longer than I used to. Even if I wasn't sure she would answer right away. But after a while, that instinct stopped arriving the same way. Not because I told it to stop. It just didn't show up. I would notice something, think about her, and then keep going. Like the step between those two things had disappeared. There was a morning when I caught myself doing that very clearly. I was walking to work. Something small happened. Something ordinary. Exactly the kind of thing I used to send her without thinking about it. And I reached for my phone automatically. Opened the conversation. Looked at the space where the message would go. And then I closed it. Not because I decided not to send anything. Just because I already knew what would happen next. Or maybe what wouldn't. And that felt different from everything that came before. Because before that, I always wrote the message first. Even if I didn't send it. This time I stopped earlier than that. Before the words existed. And I think that's when I understood something I hadn't been ready to admit yet. I hadn't just learned not to expect replies. I had learned not to begin conversations that needed them. After that, I stayed in the relationship longer than I expected I would. Not because I was waiting for something to change. Just because everything still worked in the ways that were easy to see. We still laughed. Still made plans. Still showed up for each other. From the outside, it looked like what it had always been. And in some ways it still was. But underneath the conversation, something had already gone quiet. And I didn't know how to bring it back. Or if it was something that could be brought back once it settled where it had settled. So I stayed. Not waiting. Just continuing. There was a night when that became especially clear. We were sitting next to each other again. Talking about something ordinary. Dinner. Work. Plans for the weekend. The kind of conversation that used to lead somewhere else eventually. The kind that used to open into something deeper without either of us deciding to make it happen. And I remember noticing that I had something I could have told her then. Something that had stayed with me all day. Something I would have told her earlier, once. And I didn't. Not because there wasn't time. Not because she wasn't listening. Just because I didn't expect the conversation to stay there long enough for it to matter. And when I noticed that, I realized something had already ended. Even though we were still sitting next to each other. After that, the quiet between us started feeling familiar instead of temporary. Not empty. Just finished in a different way. Like the conversation had already gone as far as it was going to go before it even started. And once something feels finished like that, you stop trying to continue it. Even if you don't say that out loud. Even if you don't decide it directly. There was a week when I realized I hadn't sent her anything during the day at all. Not because I was busy. Not because nothing happened. Just because I didn't reach for her the same way anymore. And that surprised me. Because for a long time, reaching for her had been automatic. Something that happened before I thought about it. Something that didn't need a reason. And now it did. Or maybe it needed something else. Something I couldn't name anymore. I didn't say anything about that either. I didn't say, I think something has changed. I didn't say, I think I stopped expecting replies. Because by then it didn't feel like something that belonged to one conversation. It felt like something that had already become part of how we existed together. Something that had settled quietly enough that neither of us noticed when it happened. There wasn't a clear ending. That's what still feels strange when I think about it now. There wasn't a last message. There wasn't a last conversation where everything became obvious. There was just less. Less reaching. Less starting things that needed continuation. Less expecting the conversation to come back. until eventually, there wasn't anything left to wait for. And I don't remember the exact moment I understood that. I just remember noticing one day that I wasn't checking my phone the same way anymore. Not because I was trying not to, just because I already knew what would be there, or what wouldn't. After it ended, I thought that would change. I thought maybe once the relationship was over, I would go back to the way I used to be. The way I used to send things without thinking about whether they would be answered. The way I used to expect conversations to continue. But it didn't happen like that. That expectation didn't come back. Not right away. Maybe not at all. There are still moments now when something happens during the day and I catch myself almost reaching for my phone, almost sending it to someone, almost starting the message the way I used to. And then I stop. Not because there's no one to send it to, just because something in me still remembers what it feels like when replies become uncertain. And I think that changed something permanent. Not dramatic, not obvious, just quiet. Like a habit I didn't mean to learn, but kept anyway. Sometimes I wonder when that shift really happened. Whether it started earlier than I realized. Whether it had been happening long before I noticed it. Or whether I only understood it once it was already finished. I'm not sure. I don't think I ever will be. I just know that there was a time when I reached for her without thinking. And now there are moments when I don't reach at all. Even when I want to. Even when the message is already there. Waiting. Right before it would have been sent.